On Wednesday, December 7th at 6 p.m., come meet authors Loren Spears and Robert Geake for a special book signing of From Slaves to Soldiers. That's December 7th, 6 p.m. at Tomaquag Museum, 390A Summit Street in Exeter, Rhode Island, 02822. This episode of Indigenous Lifeways is sponsored in part by the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation.
The British also used slaves in their endeavors in the colonies that they were trying to get to hang on to. Even while slave revolts were increasing, and the fear of slave revolts perpetuated even into the United States, even into the northern states, where George Washington, when he took command, again as a Virginian, was shocked to arrive in Boston and find armed blacks roaming through the city. He thought this was an abomination. How can you give weapons to black people? But eventually, because of the need for troops, not for any patriotism or necessarily a feeling that slaves should be manumitted simply for the manumission of slaves, but because they needed troops, this proposal was given to George Washington and he accepted it. So, Washington wrote to the Rhode Island General Assembly. And he wrote, and I'm quoting here from his letter, "Enclosed you will find a copy of a letter from General Barnum to me upon the means which might be adopted for completing the Rhode Island troops to their full proportion in the Continental Army. I have nothing to say in addition on this important subject, but to desire that you will give the officers employed in this business all the assistance in your power." So the proposal was placed before the General Assembly, though not without opposition. Many slaveholders in Rhode Island believed that arming former slaves would lead to insurrection on many of the larger plantations, especially those in South County. But despite these protests, the General Assembly were more inclined to favor George Washington's request, and in doing so opened the door for slave owners to choose those which among their slaves who could enlist, and even the practice of having slaves enlisted in place of young men in their family or even themselves who would normally have been drafted into the army. So they're paid a bounty of $65 in North Providence. Esek Hopkins was paid to give a slave into the Continental Army in place of his nephew. And that happened, it seemed to be a practice, especially in South County. Even into the war, even until up to the time of the War of 1812, where the slave owners in South County would enlist a slave rather than having a family member drafted into the Continental Army. So the proposal was given to the Assembly. They passed it in February of 1778. And the proclamation read, quote, "Every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave in this state may enlist into either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war with Great Britain. That every slave so enlisting shall be entitled to and receive all the bounties, wages, and encouragements allowed by the Continental Congress. That every slave enlisting shall, upon passing muster before Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free, as though he had never been encumbered with any kind of servitude or slavery." we have a great deal of slaves who take advantage of this initially. Up to 140. So many and such a rush initially that again the slave masters become alarmed and they pressure the General Assembly into limiting the time period that a slave can enlist to 3 months. And so they do that under pressure from the slave masters and the slave owners in the state. Nonetheless, a great deal of slaves do enlist. And of course, we know why they enlisted: to earn their freedom. A different story from the farm laborers who wanted to get away from the farm and saw war as a great adventure. A different story from those who were so poor it was hard to make a living, and the idea of a couple of meals a day and a tent to sleep in was a pretty good idea at the time.
Support this and other great podcast content at our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Artways. Tomaquag Arts programs are sponsored by the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. Investment in arts and culture. Music presented by Eagle and Hawk. www.eagleandhawk.com.